Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we are going to be looking at the desire argument for the existence of God. Now, the desire argument for the existence of God has been formulated by several philosophers of religion, but it's most commonly associated with C.S. Lewis. The argument is an abductive argument for best explanation. Simply, it claims that because humans have a desire for perfect happiness that can't be satisfied in this world, there must be another world where such a desire can be satisfied, and the best explanation for such a world is the existence of God. In this video, we're going to dig into this argument a bit and then look at some objections. So, before diving into this argument further, it's important to note that this is an abductive argument, or an argument from best explanation. Not only that, but it requires using abduction twice to arrive at the conclusion. Abduction is a particularly problematic and invalid form of argument in the technical sense. It relies on question begging against the skeptic. Check out my video on abduction for more on why this is an issue. So, given that it's committing a fallacy against skepticism, you'll see that this argument is one of the least convincing for me. So, one might frame this argument as follows. 1. I have a desire for perfect happiness. 2. The best explanation for that having a desire is that the object of that desire exists. Premise 3. My desire for perfect happiness cannot be satisfied in this world. Premise 4, therefore, the best explanation for my desire for perfect happiness is that another world exists where that desire can be satisfied. And premise 5, the best explanation of another world where perfect happiness exists is the existence of God, therefore God exists. We're going to look at each of these premises in turn and some of the reasons you might be concerned with them. So, premise 1. Lewis's first premise is that he has a desire for perfect happiness. In effect, unending and complete happiness. There is no way to justify such a claim, as mental states are inherently privileged. Lewis could have this desire. He might be a philosophical zombie with no mental states. However, because he wants this to apply to everyone, he also makes the case that everyone has such a desire for perfect happiness. However, I'm not convinced this is the case. I'm not conscious of such a desire personally, and it seems like such a state would be boring after a time. If anything, it seems not to be something desirable. We seem to be numbed to pleasures after we experience them over and over again for a time, so perfect, complete, unending happiness for all eternity seems largely undesirable. Life may not be worth living without some pain and some risk. See our series on Is Eternal Life Desirable for more on that question. Whether or not you think that this is desirable, anyone that doesn't think perfect happiness is desirable isn't going to accept this argument and isn't going to be convinced by it. That said, this is one of the stronger premises here. Premise number 2. The best explanation for having a desire is that the object of that desire exists. Now, it should be clear that unlike the first premise, this is the flimsiest premise of the bunch. Lewis makes the comparison with food to justify it. He argues that because we have a desire for food, the best explanation is that this food exists. If you were out in the wild, had lost all of your memories, and you started to feel hungry, the best explanation for that hunger might be that there's food out there somewhere and you should start looking for it. But let's look at some issues for this claim. So, first, there are many desires we have for things that don't exist. We have a desire to build a perpetual motion machine, but that's impossible. We have a desire to create a mathematical system that's complete, but that defies Gödel's incompleteness theorems, but that's impossible. A man might dream of a beautiful woman every night and deeply desire her, but that doesn't mean she actually exists anywhere but in his head. Second, there's a reason to think that this premise may decrease in justification as it becomes more specific. It might be the case that if you desire food, it's likely that food exists. However, if you desire a blue cheeseburger, that might not exist, even if you desire it. Similarly, this premise may be convincing if applied to happiness in general. I may desire happiness, and therefore happiness may exist. But this very specific thing that Lewis wants to call perfect happiness may be too specific to apply. It might be the blue cheeseburger out there. It doesn't mean that happiness doesn't exist, but it means that this very specific and narrowly defined version of happiness might not. Third, this proposition is not falsifiable. If you desire something that does not exist, Lewis can just contend that such a thing exists in his magical afterlife that you can't see or touch or check if the thing exists or not. Anything you desire that Lewis doesn't like, he can say is not a real or true desire because it doesn't exist in a Christian afterlife, thus begging the question against the interlocutor that thinks that such an afterlife doesn't exist. Fourth, there's some alternative explanations for desires, namely evolutionary urges to survive. This is an argument for best explanation, and so if we have an alternative explanation that's just as good, it is a defeater for this argument. We have evolutionary tendencies to desire religion because externally imposed ethical rules gave primitive societies an advantage over societies that fell to infighting and didn't have those externally imposed ethical rules. That doesn't make them more likely to be true. It just means that they're evolutionarily advantageous. Fifth, even if something exists generally, it might not exist for you at this particular time. A child might have an innate desire for a mother, but their mother might be dead. That doesn't mean that their mother magically exists somewhere. Their mother's dead. We might one day make a world where perfect happiness is possible, but we haven't made it yet. So the desire might lead us to think that such a thing may exist at some point in time, but doesn't necessarily now. Someone from 4,000 years ago might have a desire to eat 3 meals a day, but not be able to. That doesn't mean that there's an afterlife with 3 meals a day. It might simply mean we haven't developed sufficient technology to meet that desire yet. And so just because we don't have perfect happiness yet, it doesn't mean we won't ever. Sixth, because beyond physically or logically impossible things that we desire, there seem to be many people that desire things that do not exist, which are immoral. There are people that desire a world where only their race exists. That doesn't mean that there are only white people in heaven. There are people that desire that they be given the chance to torture things for eternity. It doesn't follow that the best explanation for this desire is that there's a place where they get to go to torture people after they die. Just because you want something doesn't mean that it exists. Now, premise 3. My desire for perfect happiness cannot be satisfied in this world. Depending on how much the idea of perfect happiness is unpacked, one might argue that this is a personal issue for Lewis. There are many people who seem to achieve what they would describe as happiness in this world, even complete happiness, even a well-lived life, who want nothing more out of life. Just because Lewis failed to achieve that level of happiness himself doesn't mean that there is another world out there where he would. Just because you have depression, it doesn't follow that God exists. It may make you feel better to think that there's a world where you won't be sad, but that world could just be one with some therapy and some antidepressants, a much more ontologically cheaper answer to your issues than an afterlife. And if Lewis claims that the happiness that others achieve is not perfect enough, there's a certain degree to which he's using circular reasoning, pre-assuming that the only thing that can satisfy his condition is God, when he has not experienced the happiness others have and can't judge its completeness. Premise 4. Therefore, the best explanation for my desire for perfect happiness is that another world exists where that desire can be satisfied. The issue here is the use of abduction, which, as noted above, is a deeply flawed method of reasoning. There's no means to evaluate how good any particular explanation is. The odds are against overly informative theories. There's no way to have an exhaustive list of possible theories to consider. There's no proof that there's any link between being a good explanation and being true, etc. Check out my video on abduction for all of those and more. As noted before, it seems more ontologically simple to say that maybe such a method has yet to be invented, or Lewis simply is the kind of person that can't be happy, or chose not to be happy. But most people can, instead of supposing that an entirely different world must exist, just because Lewis maybe is a little depressed. Premise 5. The best explanation of another world where perfect happiness exists is the existence of God. The abductive leap in the last premise was problematic simply because it relied on abduction. But this one is problematic not only for that reason, but also because it is a huge, gigantic leap. There seem to be many better non-theistic explanations of an afterlife, including aliens. We were in the Matrix the whole time, but outside the Matrix is nothing but happiness. In fact, this could explain the problem of why you might want perfect happiness, but also want to be able to have pain and risk as well. If you're in a world with perfect happiness, but you get bored, you might create a Matrix where you can go into this world and experience that pain and risk and then come back out to have perfect happiness again. That seems like a perfectly plausible explanation and a better explanation than whatever God nonsense Lewis is pitching. We could also say that maybe there's multiple demigods on a council that oversees the afterlife, etc. There are many other explanations, and making the case that a particular Christian God under Lewis's very specific conception of it is the only possible explanation or the best explanation seems harebrained. As with any abductive argument, we can never have all of the possible alternatives, so we can never have any confidence that a certain claim is the best one, because we don't know the comparison set. We don't know the other beliefs that we're comparing this to. Overall, C.S. Lewis generally followed the quantity over quality policy of arguments for the existence of God. This one is hardly convincing, as few abductive arguments are, and even the stronger premises seem more specific to his life and personal desires than universal maxims. C.S. Lewis had bouts of depression and grief, such as those described in his work, A Grief Observed. One can only wonder if his desire for a perfect happiness was unfulfilled because he failed to find true happiness in his life, not because it was impossible for everyone. He may have been depressed and never received treatment. That's a sad situation, but I'm depressed, therefore God is unconvincing. The better argument might have been, I'm depressed, therefore I need therapy. What do you think? Is the desire argument for the existence of God convincing? Are there some premises that ring truer than others? Are there any abductive arguments? Are any abductive arguments out there convincing? Or are they all deeply flawed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.